Let's talk about evergreen podcasting and how do you actually make money 5, 10, 20 years from now? How do you have a successful podcast 5, 20, 50 years from now? Let's talk about that. So here's an overview I want you to really pay attention to. So when we talk about how do you make a successful podcast, this is totally different from how do you actually start a podcast, right? It's not about just starting a podcast, but it's about how to start a podcast that can actually last long, like for 5 years, 10 years down the road. We're not speaking here about news podcasts. We're speaking about trends and topics that are evergreen. It's all about sustainability. And the first thing is, before you even talk about sustainability, you need to understand that the topic that you choose has to be in sync with your personality. It has to be in sync with your audience. In other words, you should care about the topic and your audience should also care about the topic. So if you're trying to have an evergreen podcast, let's say work stream, make sure the topic is evergreen, that you care about it and you are knowledgeable about it, and that your audience also is knowledgeable about, at least wants to get information about that topic. So here are the steps I want you to really think about if you're trying to have an evergreen podcast, you're trying to have a sustainable podcast. The first thing is you need to define what success means to you. What is a successful podcast for you? Let's have a conversation about that. You need to be clear about what really matters to you. Is it quantity? Is it quality? In other words, do you measure success based on the numbers? Do you measure success based on the quality of your shows, or how much aura, quote unquote, you have in society? What kind of thought leadership level you get? So those are important. Those are important elements. So what does success look to you, or what does success look like to you? So if you have a clear idea about that, this will actually kick off the whole process later on, because you're going to have a vision. You're going to have a goal towards which you can work. Very, very important. And you got to have this from the get-go. You need to define a successful podcast and what it really represents for you. In other words, you need to answer the question, the why. You need to find an answer to the why. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. We're going to have a wonderful show. So, number 2, I want to continue on what I just said earlier when I said have a why. So first of all, you need to define a successful podcast. Number 2, you need to have a why. Now, I want to dig a little deeper here when we talk about the why. The whole thing is, when we talk about a why, you need to understand, when you run a podcast, things don't always go to plan. Life happens, stuff happens. Sometimes you are inspired, sometimes you're not inspired. Stuff, maybe stuff is happening in the family, kids, whatever, your spouse, whatever. You need to understand, when things go wrong, you really need to have a solid core reason for wanting to podcast. What is driving you? What makes you wake up at 2 in the morning? Why do you have to share your info with the world? You got to have a strong why. It's very, very complicated. This is a long journey. When we talk about podcasting, especially if you are trying to have an evergreen podcasting career, you need to understand that this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. Sometimes you will be discouraged. Sometimes you will be unmotivated. Sometimes you will be uninspired. The question is, where do you find the juice in those moments? Where do you find the nerve? Where do you find the muscle to come back over and over and over? This is what's going to really drive you. This is how you are going to find an answer to the why. What's your calling? What's really driving you? If you don't have this, if you don't answer that question, you're not going to succeed in terms of developing a sustainable evergreen podcast. Answer that question, and here you have the answer to your overall success in the long run. Okay, the why is so critical. Maybe you started a podcast to share knowledge with a community. Maybe you started a podcast because something happens to you in your personal life, and you say, you know what, I don't want this to happen to other people, so I'm going to share info that I've learned throughout the process with my community. Maybe you have a vision. Maybe you have a mission. The why is going to dictate your attitude in moments of crisis. See, the why is not just for moments of joy, moments of optimism. It's really more importantly for moments of crisis, because that's what's going to determine who you really are. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We're having a conversation about Evergreen podcast, and I'm sharing with you top proven tips and hacks to always succeed in the long run. The next thing I want you to really know is that successful podcasting takes time. We live in a world right now where people are looking for success overnight. I started my podcast yesterday, and I wanted to have success yesterday, or I want to have success today. No way, Jose. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, and the earlier you can actually absorb this truth and actually internalize the truth, the better it is for you. You have no company that started like yesterday and made money today. It takes time in everything. So podcasting is not different. If you want to start podcasting, you're thinking about the overnight success, you are in the wrong category. You are in the wrong field. It's not going to happen unless you already have an audience. You have a community. Like if you are Joe Rogan or if you are David Ramsey and you want to do podcasting, then yeah, if you want to start a pod, you already have the audience elsewhere. People know you already. They know your brand. Then things become easy. But if you just Joe Blow, if you're just Jane Doe, and you're trying to start a podcast, you have to internalize the truth that successful podcasting takes time. It takes time for several reasons. You need time to improve your own skills. You need time for the search engine to actually find you. You need time for your audience to come to you, and you need time for your content to mature. It just takes time. I mean, you take big companies, they take years and years before they become whatever they are today. You take Google. Google started 25 years ago. Google was nothing. It took 25 years for this Goliath to be where it is today. Same thing with Amazon. Everybody believes that Amazon is right now the Goliath it is in e-commerce, but Amazon started a few years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago as a platform selling books. So the thing is, you have to accept the process. You got to accept that things happen. Let me give you a few pro tips. If you do not enjoy what you're doing right now, you're not going to enjoy it 5 years from now. You're not going to enjoy it even 1 year from now. You have to enjoy it right now. Find the joy in the little things you're doing now so that you can actually parlay that joy into something even better in the future. The next thing I want you to do here is to schedule. You want to stick to schedules, but make the whole thing sustainable. Now, why are schedules important? You need to understand, you want to treat your podcast as a job. I don't care if this is a side gig or it's a full-time gig. You need to actually approach it with a business mindset. If you want to have an evergreen podcast success, if you want to have something in the future, something sustainable, you have to go in it with a business mindset. So what we're talking about here, we're talking about you having some kind of planning, right? You want to have schedules. And again, I'm not trying to really tell you to make things complicated though, because the bottom line is going back to what I said about this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. So if you have schedules, make sure that you make the whole thing sustainable and make it enjoyable too. It doesn't have to become like a I don't know how to say it. Like, don't put pressure on yourself, because if you feel pressured, you're not going to survive. The whole thing is about surviving. When you run a marathon, it's all about surviving. It's all about preserving your energy in the first 20, the first 10 miles or 15 miles, so that you can actually deploy more energy in the last 5 or 7 miles. Remember that. Okay, so when we talk about having schedules, for example, if you say, you know what, I'm going to release a new podcast episodes every Monday. So I'm going to do it once a week, and I'm going to do only 20 minutes. Stick to that. If it's 5 minutes, stick to that. So whatever format you come up with, whatever schedule you have, stick to it so that you are creating consistency. And see, the consistency is great for several reasons. Number one, consistency shows your prospective listeners that you are really serious about what you're doing. Consistency is also great because you're showing to the podcast directories such as Apple Podcast or Spotify Podcast or even the the search engines such as Google, that you are consistent. You are for real. And the third thing is being consistent also helps you personally actually craft. I mean, you want to actually polish your craft down the road. You are able to hone your skills. You are able to develop your skills and improve your skills over time. Those things take time, and the more you do them, the better you become at it. The better you become. The bottom line here is that you need to accept that this is a long-term game. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We're having a conversation about Evergreen podcast, and I'm sharing with you our top proven tips and hacks to survive in the long run and to survive and to be successful while doing it. The next thing I want you to think about here is to actually to avoid being stuck on the launch. See, the whole thing is a lot of new podcasters to think about. I'm going to launch my podcast, and this is like a D-Day, and everything revolves around D-Day. No. You launch your podcast. Maybe you launch your podcast on December 1st, and let that December 1st just come and go. That's it. Okay, it's just a day. Don't try to make everything around it. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you don't have a lot of subscribers, a lot of listeners on December 1st, that doesn't mean that your podcast is doomed for failure. No, it's just a day. All right, it's just a day. Stuff happens. Sometimes you have bad days. Sometimes you have good days, and the same is true for your podcast. Your podcast is going to have good days and bad days, as long as you keep at it, as long as you are consistent. As long as you show up to work, you actually get the job done, and you are consistent. You are going to have bad days and good days, but overall, you are going to grow. It's not going to happen overnight. So this is why I'm just telling you, do not get stuck on the launch day. Do not really think about, how come I'm not getting, how come I did not get all the subscribers, all the listeners that I was supposed to get on launch day? So what? You had 2 listeners on D-Day. So what? 2 listeners are two listeners. Appreciate those listeners. Be grateful that you have 2 listeners. Yes, you wanted to have 2,000 listeners, but you had only 2. Okay, so what? It's a long game. You have to appreciate the process. You need to acknowledge that there are pros and cons of this podcasting game. And the bottom line here is the more you keep at it. Again, going back to what I said earlier, the more you keep at it, the better it is. Now, here is a decision time for you. My question to you is, do you have a launch date for your podcast? In other words, are you a new podcaster? If you are, have you revolved everything around your launch date, or your launch date is just a launch date? What I'm trying to say is your launch date important for you? Do you have a series of events around the launch date, or this is just one date among others? If you're a new one. Now, if you are an existing podcaster, are you trying to rebrand your brand? Are you trying to rebrand your podcast, or what? So what are we talking about a launch date here? Are you trying to launch something else besides your podcast? Talk to me about that. The next thing I want you to really think about here is you need to know what your target audience wants. See, the whole thing is that as podcasters, we want to actually survive in the long run. But the thing is, what podcasters do not understand when it comes to evergreen podcast hacks is that you need to add value. If you don't add value, you're not going to grow. It's not about just having listeners. A lot of folks, based on our research, a lot of podcasters just focus on the analytics, which is great. That's fine. Don't get me wrong. But it's just better to focus on the value you are adding to your audience. If you add value, the audience will realize that, and they will reward you multifold through better stats, better money. So you will be able to monetize your content. You'll be able to share your content across multiple platforms. So the first thing you want to focus on is adding value. Always think about adding value. So when you think about having an evergreen podcast, think about an evergreen topic that your audience will care about today, but also 10 years from now, 20 years from now, maybe not the same audience, but maybe different audience members. And this is important. And one thing I want to say also is that when we talk about, let me give you what I want to say here is when we talk about getting what your audience wants, be clear from the get-go about who your audience really is. In other words, who your audience members are. You need to define your audience persona, your listener persona. And the clearer you are about your listener persona, the better it is, because then you can craft content that your listener persona has to love or love anyway. Here is a decision for you. Right now, I want you to write down a few ideas around your preferred listener, your listener persona: age, profession, gender, if needed, geography, like your listeners' location. If you're doing a podcast that is geo-centered, geo-restricted, then you want to focus on geography and their profession. So those are elements that will help you actually sort of narrow down your target audience. And once you have a clear idea about your target audience, then you can craft, again, content for their target audience. The bottom line is you need to add value. If you add value, you are going to grow. That's just it's just systematic. It is automatic. It's just and this is really in the natural law. It's really the natural law of things. I mean, on this earth, some people call it karma, or you can call it whatever you want to hear. But if you are given value, value will be given back to you. That's for sure. The next thing I want you to really think about here is that you want to actually find ways to define your success. If you remember, at the beginning of this show, I asked you a question about how do you define success? And it's really important to understand that if you're trying to define your success as audience participation, you might be disappointed. Do not rely on audience participation. A common mistake that many new podcasters make is to build their shows around an audience that doesn't yet exist. If your episodes are about answering podcast listeners' questions or doing live shows, it's just better to do things like gradually. So you need to actually create podcast the content that appeals to folks no matter what. It's important to do things and define success in a way that you can control things. You cannot control audience participation. You can't control audience engagement, but you can control your own level of engagement. This is what you should focus on. And from the get-go, this is what you want to really focus on. The bottom line here is that you need to understand that your audience is there to support you, but as long as you are thinking about adding value, the audience will come sooner or later. The audience may come in 1 month, in 1 year, in 10 years, and in 100 years, but the audience will come. Just focus on adding value. And the last thing I want to tell you here is that when we talk about Evergreen podcast, your microphone is not that important. Okay, I know on this show and other shows, we have talked about the importance of podcast equipment, including microphones. Yes, that's important because as a podcaster, your voice is your number one instrument. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, that's important. Your voice is quite essential. The audio quality is quite essential. However, your microphone is not that essential, at least when you start. When you start, what's really important is the power of your message. It's your ability to resonate. It's your ability to engage with your audience. It's your ability to talk to them about topics that they care about. That's what really matters. That's what matters at the beginning of your podcasting career. Now, once you have an entire production business behind you, once you have a staff helping you out, you can invest in like a high gear or high priced gear, microphones, and what have you, to actually deliver more. But at the beginning, the most important is not your microphone. So be really careful about that, and do not actually, break the bank by spending thousands of dollars on a microphone. Okay, and almost any podcast mic you can find these days will be good enough. Even you can start with your microphone with your phone to start with, and it's actually your recording environment and the mic techniques that have the biggest impact on audio quality. So always be clear that you are in a safe environment, in a quiet environment, and you're able to record appropriately. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. In today's conversation, I was sharing with you Evergreen podcast. We share with you top proven tips and hacks, and I give you the overview. And then I give you a few steps to find a successful podcast. Have a why. Know that successful podcasting takes time. Stick to schedules. Don't get stuck on the launch. Know what your target audience wants. Don't rely on audience participation. And remember that your microphone is important, but not that important. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll speak to you another time. But until then, remember, stay marvelous.